And we're filming.
All right. So this chapter is basically going to answer the question, should a company invest in X, Y, or Z? How do we make those types of decisions? How are we going to make the decision? What type of criteria will help us as people who are working in the finance department make the type of decision on a capital expenditure or so on? So net present value and other investment criteria, you're going to kind of almost be decision-making tools. Okay? With this chapter, there's a couple things that we're going to leave out that are noted here. We're going to want to understand the payback rule and its shortcomings. We're not going to cover accounting rates of return and their problems. There's problems with these. There's no real reason to go into that. But you should know that there's a number of ways to go about decision-making criteria. One's the payback rule. One's accounting rate of return. We're going to skip through that. It's good to know that there's an alternative method, though, and that's the accounting rate of return. We're going to talk in depth about the internal rate of return and its strengths and weaknesses. We're going to talk about the net present value and why it is the best decision criteria. So this one's the one we really want to know, hence why it's the title of the chapter. We'll talk about the MIRR, or the modified internal rate of return, and we're not really going to get too into the profitability index. So, two areas that we're not going to cover too much for the sake of your quiz: the accounting rates of return and the profitability index. All the other areas in the chapter we'll go over. So we'll start off with this net present value, then we'll talk about the payback rule. You can read about the average accounting rate of return. We'll discuss the internal rate of return, and you guys can read about the profitability index. We will discuss the practice of capital budgeting at the end. All right, capital budgeting. With capital budgeting, of course, there's going to be an analysis of potential projects. So the thought here is that you're in a situation where perhaps you have a plant, you're manufacturing textbooks or something like that. Are you going to buy a new building? Are you going to buy machinery to create the textbooks? Those types of purchases are capital investments. And you need to create a budget in order to make effective decisions. So we're going to be looking at the analysis of potential projects. These are going to tend to be long-term decisions. So I like to think of it as a plant. You're a manufacturer and you're buying a plant. When you buy a plant, it's definitely not a short-term decision, right? It's more of a long-term decision. You bought the plant. You can't just sell it right away. So think of it like that. I think that's the best way to kind of think about these things. Of course, a plant, if you purchased one, it's going to be a large expenditure. And that's one of the reasons it's a long-term decision. You can't reverse it right away. It's difficult or impossible to reverse, and it determines the firm's strategic direction. So if you're a manufacturer in the Philadelphia area, or in this area of Pennsylvania, and you want to expand your practice overseas, or maybe even down south in the U.S., that's a huge strategic decision. Maybe there's a rationale for that. Maybe you're producing textbooks and you believe that you can get cheaper resources to create the textbook in, I don't know, maybe down south because they have bigger paper plants down there. I don't know. So it'll save you money. It's a strategic move to do something like that. So this is going to determine the firm's strategic direction. So there's ways of making decisions on these topics, and there's some good decision criteria which should at least ask these types of questions. First, are all the cash flows considered? Meaning, are we considering not just the down payment on this plant, but is everything going to be incorporated that will be coming in from it as well? Is the time value of money, or TVM, considered? And we've discussed what the time value of money is in past classes. Is is this decision to invest in this plant risk adjusted? In other words, how much are we taking into account risk? Do we have the ability to rank projects if we have several? So let's say we have several alternatives. We could move overseas. We could move to a plant in Atlanta. We could move a plant out west in Denver. Which is the best move? Can we rank them with our decision criteria? And does it indicate added value to the firm? So a good decision would be able to say yes to pretty much all of these. Speaking of a good decision-making criteria, the net present value is probably one of the better ones. And with this, we're asking how much value is created from undertaking an investment. The first step here is going to estimate the expected future cash flows. The second step is going to be to estimate the required return for projects of this risk level. And then the third step is going to be to find the present value of the cash flows and subtract the initial investment to arrive at the net present value. So, we're going to want to start by thinking about, okay, we believe this decision would take in this amount of money in the future. Estimate expected future cash flows. We also want to think about, back here, what do we need? So what would this thing bring in, and what do we need it to bring in? Okay? And then we measure the two. The required rate of return is asking, what do we need this decision to bring in order to make it relevant? So if you think about it, really what we're doing here is we're looking at benefit versus cost, right? So what do we need it to bring in? And then we find the present value of the cash flows and subtract that from that initial investment to arrive at the NPV. Okay, we're going to do some examples of that. Another thing to keep in mind before we move on, though, is just to highlight this word, future cash flows. Remember, it's going to be forecasted. Okay? So it's something to keep in mind. Okay, so the net present value formula looks like this. And this is something that we've seen in the past, or at least it should look familiar. The one thing to point out here, obviously in red, is that this is now 0. And this is important because it's not going to work exactly the same way that it's worked in the past for us in Excel, because of that 0. The initial cost is often considered CF0. That's the little 0. It's called a naught. And it is an outflow. So this is the stuff that we're used to with a 1 down there. Okay? We have to subtract out that initial investment afterwards. So just to give you a real quick synopsis, when you buy that plant in Atlanta, that costs money, right? So that's an outflow. And then you're hoping that in year 1, year 2, and year 3, so on, you're going to make money back, right? So you have that outflow, and then CF1 should be an inflow, and CF2 should be an inflow, and so on and so forth. What this is saying is, this is the type of thing we're used to seeing, but we're also going to have to remember to subtract that initial outflow. That happens right at the outset. All right. If NPV is positive, you're going to accept this project. This is why this thing's called a decision-making tool or decision-making criteria. You're basically using this net present value to help you make decisions. And if you get an answer above 0, you should do it. Okay, it's a good decision for your firm to make. So if NPV is positive, accept the project. You should buy that plant in Atlanta. If NPV is positive, it means that the project is expected to add value to the firm, and it will increase the wealth of the owners. NPV is a direct measure of how well this project will meet the goal of increasing shareholder wealth. And this is why I said this chapter is important, and this concept is probably one of the more important concepts that you're going to learn in the course, is because of this. Our goal in finance is to maximize shareholder wealth, right? So if NPV is a direct measure of how well this project will meet the goal of increasing shareholder wealth, This is a great decision-making tool. All right, so we're going to work with a little project here. Looking at a new project and have estimated the following cash flows, net income, and book value. So, year 0, right now, you are going to purchase something for $165,000. In year 1, you expect to reap in about $63,000. Year 2, $70,000. In year 3, $91,000. Your net income is $13,000 in year 1. Net income in year 2 is $3,300, and year 3 is $29,100. The average book value is $72,000. Your required return for assets. Hey, how you doing? Your required return for assets of this risk is 12%. Okay? So this project will be the example for all the project exhibits in this chapter. So this is kind of the big one. And we'll be working with this. Alright. So let me open up Excel. While I do that, I'm going to do this real quick.